Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Citron Recruitment's Equity Investments in Healthcare Practices webinar. My name is James Noble. I'm a marketing associate with Citron Recruitment, and I'm here today to introduce you to our panelists and moderator. So our panelists today are Nixon Peabody's Michael Schnipper and Citron Recruitment partner Heather Varner. Michael represents both buyers and sellers in the purchase and sale of businesses in a wide range of industries, including healthcare services. He works with a diverse team of Nixon Peabody attorneys in the representation of private practices involving complex legal and business issues with respect to private equity transactions, as well as private practice hospital integration. Heather Varner is a member of Citron Recruitment's Mergers and Acquisitions tax team, where she provides tax consulting for both buy and sell side transactions, including tax structuring, tax due diligence, and tax modeling for partnerships, corporations, and private equity funds. She has specific experience with healthcare transactions in the private equity space. And our moderator today is Citron Recruitment partner Lee Ferber. Lee is a partner in Citron Recruitment's Long Island healthcare practice, where he works collaboratively with physician owners and their management teams, advising them in both sell-side and buy-side transactions with a focus on the financial, tax, and business implications associated with transactions primarily in the private equity space. And with that said, I'll pass it off to Lee.
Great, thank you, Jimmy. And I guess as any questions come in, we could take it one step at a time, and a lot of the questions may get answered as we go through the presentation, or we could break during the presentation if there are questions that are coming in. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Private Equity Investments in Healthcare Practices, Evaluating Opportunities and Risks in Private Equity Transactions, what to expect, how to plan, and best practices to maximize purchase price. We're going to be covering a lot. This is really just a very broad overview of the M&A practice, of what's involved in an M&A transaction. For some of you, it may be elementary. For some of you that are in the midst of a transaction, hopefully there'll be some pointers that come out to help you. Some are thinking about it, maybe a year or two away. We'll discuss, what you should be thinking about in terms of early stage planning, but there will be, quite a bit to cover. So here are the panelists that'll be in the webinar with me. This is a presentation overview. The first 10 minutes or so is going to really be just an overview of what's going on in healthcare, specifically in the private equity space within healthcare. So we'll discuss some healthcare industry statistics, drivers of M&A activity in healthcare, private equity-backed healthcare practice models, the challenges faced by practice owners, questions practice owners are asking, and EBITDA on risk, the drivers of value. The real crux of the webinar, and all the panelists will be providing and discussing these specific topics, is overview of the M&A process from early stage planning, pre-qualifying buyers, acquisition strategies and evaluation, deal structuring and negotiations, transaction execution and due diligence. And then we'll end with how to respond to an offer to buy, and then some final thoughts, including our suggestions for really putting together a strong M&A advisory team. So when we talk about the physician service sector, we listed roughly 14 or so different specialties. You could probably add another 150 to this. Based on the way healthcare has been over the last few years, there are more and more specialties and subspecialties. But physician services covers everything from your traditional physician practice, whether it's primary care, multi-specialty, or specialists, whether it's behavioral health, cardiology, OBGYN, and also all the other services that are ancillary, anesthesiology, diagnostic services, whether it's labs or MRI facilities. So this is just a quick snapshot of just what's going on in the private equity market with respect to healthcare. And this isn't just healthcare practices. It could be hospital-based transactions, including some technology-based healthcare businesses. So this pretty much is a snapshot of what's been happening from the first quarter of 23 through the third quarter of 24. And the blue line is the capital invested, and the the bar is the actual deal count. So if you look at it, the deal count reached a high of roughly close to 14 billion in the third quarter of 23, and it's generally been trending down. And a lot of the reasons for that big bump in 23 was there was a lot of money on the side as a result of COVID that came back into the market. So the latest data available was in 2024 Q3, the last bar. There was 147 reported deals, and again, these are private equity, so there's a lot that's not included here, with a deal value of roughly $5 billion. So what's driving M&A activity in healthcare? M&A activity came to a screeching halt in 2020, and as a result, private equity-backed healthcare investors built up cash reserves and ultimately created pent-up demand for new investments. So all of a sudden in 22 and 23, we saw a big increase in the deals and the size of those deals in the physician space. So what's driving M&A activity in physician services? The physician services sector continues to establish itself as a resilient and growing healthcare sector for private equity investment due to multiple factors. The physician service sector is still highly fragmented. You just go to any doctor's appointment and there are medical buildings with a tremendous number of individual independent practices, some of which have been acquired, but there's still a lot out there for private equity to add on to their initial investments. Private equity's desire to play a bigger role in healthcare consolidation and the overall transformation of the healthcare landscape. The continued growth in earnings prospects with private equity's existing investments in physician practices. You very rarely hear of a physician practice, large or small, going out of business, going into bankruptcy. The licensed professionals that probably are not going anywhere. And then COVID-19 itself, the fact that the physician services sector rebounded in 21 from the challenges they faced during the pandemic really tells a lot about the prospects for private equity. So the business model, it's a pretty typical model that you see not only in healthcare transactions, but in really any deal that's private equity based. As healthcare markets become saturated, private equity continues to grow by acquiring larger centers in new geographic areas to gain a foothold, and then acquiring strategic add-ons with smaller practices. By combining healthcare technology investments with investments in healthcare practices, some of the recent deals I've been involved with have historically been the founders really invested in healthcare technology, and then ultimately brought in practices that could align with that technology that they developed. At the end of the day, while private equity loves healthcare, they're not in love with healthcare. It's a portfolio investment for them. So ultimately, they want to grow and ultimately sell up by merging with larger private equity-backed regional and national healthcare platforms. Could be Summit Healthcare, Care One, CityMD, but that's the goal of private equity in general, and it's no different in healthcare. Challenges faced by practice owners, questions practice owners are asking. So the challenges faced by healthcare practices, and this kind of aligns with a lot of practices want to sell or look for opportunities for buyers, and private equity is interested in acquiring. So in terms of the challenges faced by healthcare practices and any physicians or management people that are on the call that are managing healthcare practices know this, the administrative burden of managing multiple centers, increased regulatory compliance and oversight, downward reimbursement pressure, transition to value-based payment models or population health, increased financial risk, i.e. personal guarantees on any type of lines of credit, and succession issues. Like every industry, the baby boomer generation, doctors included, are at the point where they're not sure, what their options are in terms of selling a practice, or maybe the best option is to join a hospital system. Other challenges faced by healthcare practices, investments in new technologies. Any practices that have been involved for more than 10, 15 years know that with the 2010 passage of the Affordable Care Act, EMR became a big area, large investments. During the pandemic, it was telemedicine. Now AI is clearly entering the space in terms of healthcare. Other challenges, staffing shortages, retaining providers. Anyone that's trying to get an appointment for a specialist, no, it's a challenge. You may have to wait a month, 45 days to get an appointment. And probably the biggest reasons why physician practices are under more pressure is competition. It could be from hospitals, joint ventures with insurance carriers, franchise operators. Anyone in urgent care probably knows American Family Care. They're probably the largest franchisor for urgent care. And private equity-backed platforms, which are pretty much the large players out there that you hear that are both single specialty and multi-specialty. And not surprisingly, everyone wants instantaneous appointments and be able to get in touch with a physician or provider pretty quickly. So now you have retail healthcare, Amazon One Medical. You could get onto Amazon, and besides buying whatever items you want to buy, you could get in touch with the doctor or provider via telemedicine versus Amazon One Medical. And the other challenge is just the COVID pandemic burnout. As a result of the COVID pandemic, a lot of physicians are just that they've kind of had it, and they're looking to find ways to exit. So questions practice owners are asking: how do I continue to grow and build value for my business? Should I invest in new locations, service lines, or ancillary services? Should I look for additional partners, or do I remain independent? What are the risks and benefits of staying independent or joining a larger organization? And should I consider partnering with other independent operators? And that's where a number of you probably have heard this whole concept of the super MSO model, which is kind of a way to integrate practices without formally exiting your PC, which is actually where you bill for patient services. So the number one question practice owners are asking: how do I continue to position my business for growth while at the same time mitigate my financial risk and maybe take some money off the table? And the number two question practice owners are asking: is now the right time to sell? And that goes for any business owner, especially when they're closer to the end of their career than the beginning. So this will be real quick, just to take you through it. Most of you who have been involved with any type of transaction know that the two drivers of value in any deal is EBITDA and risk. And I'm always asked the question: why is it that two healthcare practices with similar EBITDA or earnings achieve different valuations? Has to do with all the factors you see here: number of sites, number of providers, provider mix, payer mix, patient volume, reimbursement trends, staffing, procedures, ancillary services offered, and other key performance indicators and metrics. The concept of multiples, which is essentially applying a multiple 1, 2, 3, 4 times the EBITDA, in my view, is really just a way to establish the purchase price, kind of a coming out offer. But yet, nonetheless, that's the basis for moving forward with a transaction and eventually moving to a letter of intent. So at this point, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of the presentation, which is an overview of the M&A process, from early stage planning, pre-qualifying buyers, acquisition strategies, and evaluation of targets, transaction execution, and due diligence. And we'll be discussing all of this from the financial side, the legal side, and we can't forget taxes, because depending on the state that you're in and how the deal is structured, you have to figure every dollar in a purchase price. You're talking probably 30 to 40% in terms of what's going out in terms of taxes. So that's important as you go through a transaction. So I'll just have Heather or Mike chime in at this point, but early stage planning, preparing for a sale. Start preparing well before the search for a buyer begins. And I think all of us will agree early planning equals the best chance to maximize purchase price. Focus on those areas where there are opportunities to increase earnings and to reduce risk. And from the Mike side, why don't you chime in on what you look for well in advance of a transaction regarding legal?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I'll focus on the legal. Heather and Lee can speak to the financial reporting and taxes. But as you'll see later in this presentation, one of the key components of an M&A transaction is legal due diligence. And any buyer that you transact with, whether it's an MSO, a private equity firm, or a larger practice, is going to do comprehensive legal due diligence. my recommendation for someone considering a sell side process is to do their own internal sell side diligence. Look at your own shop, clean up everything that can be cleaned up before the buyer sees it. Most importantly, if there are skeletons in the closet, and there often are, make sure that your advisors are aware. Legal advisors, accounting advisors, financial advisors. The worst thing you could do is leave your advisor sort of flat-footed when buyer or buyer's counsel identifies an issue. I'll just give some examples. Check all your employment agreements. Do you have employment agreements with your providers? Are they current? Have they expired? Are there commitments in there that have either passed that you haven't honored or that are coming up? One of the big ones in medical practices is a lot of provider employment agreements have provisions about potential elevation to partner. You should know what's happening there, when that's happening, what the mechanics for that are, and be prepared to deal with that as part of a transaction. Look at your litigation history, be prepared to answer why and how you've improved such that that's not an issue anymore. Look at your cap table, and by cap table, I mean your list of owners, number of shares or membership interests. Make sure that it tracks the documents. If someone withdrew from your partnership and you haven't documented it, you should. That's one of the fundamental parts of an M&A transaction, is that your ownership matches your documents. But there's a whole laundry list. What I would do with a client is provide them sort of abbreviated buy-side due diligence list and go through it with them and talk through it, ask for documents, and clean up things that would be an issue if a buyer were looking at them. Heather, you want to add on the financial side?
I can add for the tax side. As far as due diligence, the key items there is that we find in diligence is often practices aren't filing all of their income taxes in all of the states that they have nexus in and have never performed a nexus study. And also for sales and use tax are like two hot areas for healthcare. Lee, do you want to talk about the financial part?
Yeah, and Heather, we'll get to some slides on taxes. She'll discuss a little bit more about tax modeling, tax structuring. But on the right side of the screen, improving the quality of financial reporting. I don't know how many times I get a call from a physician owner that they provided cash basis tax returns to a potential buyer or business broker, and it doesn't really tell the story about the practice. So prospective buyers need a level of financial reporting that allows them to properly assess the accuracy of historical earnings. In the private equity world, it's GAAP, or generally accepted accounting principles, that basis of reporting. The reality is most practices are cash basis. They file a tax return. They may not have that type of reporting available. It's not a real issue. You just have to address it early on. Owners should be investing in their accounting departments early on to improve financial reporting. That's kind of an obvious one. Doesn't always happen though. And we'll get into quality of earnings, which is the backbone of M&A financial due diligence, a little bit later. The importance of pre-qualifying potential buyers. Going down the road with the wrong buyer is just a time waster. It disrupts and detracts from time spent on your business's core operations and can impact goodwill with your staff and management team. And we talk about impacting goodwill. It's not a financial term per se. It's just, you don't want your staff getting wind that you're selling the business. They may not have a job anymore. You don't want word getting out there in the market that you're shopping around your practice. So you just have to be really careful before you entertain any offers or have discussions with a business broker or just directly with a buyer that you address this. Mike, any thoughts on this?
I guess the one thing I'd add, Lee, is I think sellers are a little bashful on reverse due diligence. It's really a two-way street. So you should expect as a seller, whether you're selling 100% or looking for a capital investor and a partner, that there'll be significant due diligence. But you should also be doing due diligence on your potential acquirer or partner. I know, Lee, one of the subsequent slides has some questions to ask, but one of them should be, can you give us some referrals for parties you've done deals with, and have conversations with them and find out what the operational history was like and what the relationship was like, because especially if you're not selling 100%, these will be your partners for some period of time post-closing.
Yeah, and Michael, you just said there's no reason not to ask. It shows that you're informed, that you take the transaction seriously. Finding about deals recently closed. Is it the first deal they ever made in healthcare? The size and corporate structure. Are you dealing with a Summit Healthcare or an Optum, or are you dealing with a smaller private equity practice? Operating synergies. Post-transaction, you're staying on. See what type of EMR, see what type of billing platform, practice management software they have. These are not deal breakers, but you might as well know what's involved. Integration and technology capabilities. In a perfect world, by the time you go live in the new venture, you've already integrated your infrastructure and your technology. Financial stability, that's a little more of a challenge because these are not generally public companies, but you try to get some sense of the financial stability in terms of a buyer. You don't want to have an earnout where part of the purchase price is paid over time, and you find out that they're teetering on bankruptcy or just don't have the real cash flow or lines of credit to eventually pay out the remaining purchase price. And of course, culture fit. Like Mike said, if you're staying on in any capacity, might as well know your partners. Acquisition strategies and evaluation of targets. This is where it's important as best you can. Try to know where you want to end up. Try to find out what your real end goal is. So by that, we mean establish the parameters that will drive your search, understand the types of targets and synergies that will lead to post-transaction operational and financial success, and understand the potential financial and operational benefits you would like to achieve and the risk you are looking to mitigate. There's a lot here, but the bottom line is you want to try to, as early as possible, and sometimes there's a learning curve as you go through potential opportunities with buyers. You want to try to really identify what you're looking for at the end of a transaction. Mike, any thoughts on this?
I guess to put maybe a finer point on that, and I'll do it with an example, right? So I do a fair amount of sell-side transactional work in the healthcare space, and some clients will come to me and say, we want to partner with a private equity firm. We want to be the pillar practice of the platform. Those doctors and non-doctor employees of that practice are really looking for access to capital, a partner who can help operationally, but they want to stay very much involved in governance and growth and strategic decisions. And then there's other clients that come to me and say, I really want to partner with an established MSO, one that's possibly far along in its life, with the expectation that there'll be some rollover equity and then a subsequent transaction. And frankly, they don't want to be involved in governance and administrative responsibility and growth and M&A. And they're really looking to essentially become a W-2 employed doctor and have hopefully a second bite at the apple in the near term. And I've had those conversations, and some clients will change their mind as they get more informed, but that's like a real early stage decision to make before you start working with investment bankers to identify prospective partners.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we had a client who was a fairly large OBGYN group that was looking for a potential investor. They ended up being acquired, or at least sold their non-clinical assets, to probably the largest women health provider in the US. And what really drove that was that the doctors didn't want to start investing in surgery centers, in fertility clinics, all the things that they really would have liked to do. But by doing that, by having a large private equity-backed women's health group support them, there were investments being made where the doctors also got to participate in those investments. So that's also, like Mike was saying, it's just understanding what you're looking for at the end. Do you want to become a W-2 employee and that's it? Or you're looking for a real partner, especially if there's rollover equity, where you're essentially have to roll over part of your proceeds into the new entity. that creates a totally different type of synergy with a potential buyer. Deal structuring and negotiations, choosing the optimal structure for the transaction to achieve the most beneficial tax result. Heather, we're going to get into more details, but if you want to just give a broad overview of some of the differences and challenges, benefits, and minuses with stock versus asset sales.
Sure. So the first thing I look at when I'm evaluating the tax consequences to the buyer and the seller is how the deal is structured. So at a 100-foot level, that's, we first look to see if it's a stock or an asset sale. So buyers typically prefer an asset sale because they get to step up the basis of all the assets to fair market value, and then that delivers them depreciation, amortization deductions over the years. Conventional knowledge in the past was that sellers typically preferred a stock sale if that was available. But because of the PTT, which we can talk about, sometimes the asset sale is also beneficial for the seller. And so if you're a seller, the difference is first is hot asset gain. So if you're selling your assets and you have gain in inventory, or you have cash-based receivables or depreciated assets, that portion of that gain is taxed at ordinary rates as ordinary income and not capital gains rates. So that will often surprise sellers where they've owned this business for a very long time and they're expecting to sell their business and get capital gain treatment. That is not necessarily going to be true if there is an asset sale. And then if you did an asset sale or stock sale and you're in a C Corp solution, then that subjects you to double layer of tax if you do an asset sale. Very rarely do I see asset sales out of a C corporation, but an asset sale you can do an asset sale in a S corporation, which we can also get into that structuring in a second as well. But you'll have two levels of tax if it's in a C corporation. And then the third big difference between a stock and an asset sale for the seller is that gain is apportioned to everywhere the entity does business, whereas on a stock sale, it's generally sourced to the domicile of the seller. So if you are a Florida resident or a Texas resident, New Hampshire, you'll have zero state tax on the sale of your stock. However, if you sold the assets out of your entity, it's going to get apportioned to everywhere your entity does business. So if you do business in multiple states or non-income tax states, then you will trigger state tax where you otherwise would not. And so those are the three main differences between a stock and an asset sale.
Lee, I'll jump in there on it.
Yeah, sure.
So this is an area where I get to work very closely with Heather and Lee when we're doing a transaction, because healthcare deals are, I'd argue, more complex than non-healthcare deals. In some cases, stock deals are not available because the buyer is not a permitted owner of a practice in a state, right? There's corporate practice of medicine restrictions in a lot of states. There's also often you want to look to whether or not you want to keep the seller's tax ID number on a post-closing basis. And then there's third-party and government consents. I know Lee had mentioned earlier ambulatory surgery centers. So that's one, right, where you have a certificate of need and you have some real complex state laws. So Heather and I and Lee would sit down and talk through the tax consequences, but also things like liability and consents and survival of payer contracts and payer rates, and ultimately come up with what's optimal. And then you also have to do this in collaboration with the other side, right? Because they have some counter objectives to what the seller has.
And going on to negotiating some key deal terms, purchase price obviously is the big one. Cash at close versus installment sale, which also is considered or called an earnout. Indemnity holdback provisions for potential contingent liabilities. Milestones or other triggers for earnouts. On a $20 million deal, you may get $15 million up front, $5 million in 2 installments over 2 or 3 years, as long as you achieve certain levels of EBITDA. That's usually the main trigger for getting the balance of the payout. Net working capital and other post-closing adjustments. I have a transaction right now. It's now within that 90-day period post-close. I just got an email from the seller this morning. Now they have to do what's called the true up to see if the net working capital that they actually gave to the buyer was at the level that they projected or estimated back at closing. Purchase price allocation. And then there are tax elections. For instance, IRS code 338H10. I'll let Heather discuss that in a little while. But anything, Mike, or you want to add in terms of negotiating deal terms before we move to the next slide?
I guess one thing I would add here is those items you just referenced, Lee, are like fundamental deal issues. I recommend that these be addressed in a letter of intent, and not something that's pushed to the period between letter of intent and definitive documents. Maybe I'll take 1 second, right? A lot of times when you do these types of transactions, they're staged. There's multiple phases. So there'd be some financial, tax, accounting, due diligence. You might get an indication of interest from a buyer, which is a less formal, higher level than a letter of intent. Sometimes you skip that, go right to the letter of intent. A letter of intent would be more detailed than an indication of interest. But those terms that Lee just referenced, purchase price, holdback, earnouts, net working capital, at least conceptually, those should be in the letter of intent. Then you do your legal due diligence, get to definitive documents. I know I probably got ahead of us, Lee, on slides.
No, that's fine. And listen, it kind of talks about what you just mentioned, kind of address what we spoke about earlier. You don't want to go down the road and find out there are real deal issues. You might as well address them before the letter of intent, because at that point, that's where the attorneys and the financial advisors, you start spending, decent amount of money to get proper advice on a deal. So you really want to address those things early on and see if you can come to an agreement with the buyer. Effective
Oh, sorry,
negotiation.
Lee, can we go
Yeah,
back to that slide? I have a couple of tax items on those things.
Yeah.
So particularly for healthcare, for providers, earnouts, a tax implication there is that sometimes earnouts are tied to the physician's services, that they have to be employed for a certain amount of time, or they have to do something. And that can sometimes put that payment into compensation territory as opposed to additional purchase price. When something is going to be taxed to a provider as compensation, that's at ordinary rates. And so I would, work with the attorneys to try to get some language into the agreement so that both sides agree to how that earnout is going to be treated between the two parties consistently, between the buyer and the seller, so that on the sell side, you get to treat that as hopefully capital gain as opposed to ordinary income. And then the last point there with the purchase price allocation, the buyer and sellers have different interests there as well. Sometimes like the purchase price allocation methodology just like missed in the agreement entirely, but buyer and seller have different interests and where they want to put the value. So buyers want the value to be in fixed assets, but that can cause ordinary income to the sellers because that would create hot asset gain. And so you want that methodology to be determined, at LOI or at, prior to closing, so that when the deal closes and everybody's off to the 4 wins, that there's not an argument about it after the closing. That's about it. That's all I got.
Yep, that was good. As far as effective negotiation strategies, ask for advice, even from the buyer. Know when to compromise, request sufficient time. If you get an offer, to buy, you don't have to respond today, tomorrow, the next week. You need time, and that's what the buyer will recognize. You do need time. Manage your emotions, balance impulse. Instinctive, emotional, and irrational behavior really doesn't help versus being deliberate and logical thinking. And every deal becomes emotional. That's just the reality of it. But it's our job as advisors to kind of calm the sellers down and take a little bit of time to digest it and come back with a proper response. Stay calm and confident, yet assertive. Consider engaging a transaction advisor, really kind of an arbitrator, and a transaction advisor, whether you call it a business broker, an investment banker for larger deals, it's all the same. They have resources to go out and identify targets, buyers that you may not be aware of. And even though you pay them a success fee, there's really value in doing that. We're now going to get into due diligence. And so due diligence is an investigation of a potential investment that allows the buyer to confirm pertinent information about the seller, protect themselves from risky deals, make an informed decision with a higher degree of certainty, and ultimately place a value on the business. And diligence does have a direct impact on purchase price. And I'm sure all of us have seen this on a call. You have a letter of intent, everything looks great. And now the buyer comes in and does their full financial or legal diligence, and they see risky areas, income that may not be sustainable going forward, legal issues that they didn't know about. And guess what? The letter of intent is just a more formal agreement, but it's not a binding agreement as far as the dollar value of the purchase price. Mike, you want anything with respect to that? I'm sure you do.
I think you hit the nail on the head, right? You mentioned earlier Q of E, quality of earnings, and that happens very early in a transaction. At least I think the three of us would recommend that it happen as early as possible in the transaction. And that's where a seller is going to try and push value up as much as possible, and hopefully has advisors like Lee and Heather to help combat a buy-side Q of E that takes issue with what's in the sell-side Q of E. But that's where you're pushing value up. The legal due diligence is an area where you exceedingly rarely would see value go up, but you can, as Lee says, see value go down. A buyer identifies a risk profile that they weren't aware of pre-due diligence, whether that's litigation history, a government investigation history, maybe an issue with some of the sources of revenue, as Lee mentioned, or the costs are actually higher once they see the vendor contracts. So, having pre-done sell-side due diligence to get an understanding of where your risks are, being prepared to answer those questions, that's where your sell-side advisors help you preserve value. You're unlikely to find more value in this stage, but you could lose value. So you really need to be prepared.
Agreed. And we'll get into the financial aspects in a moment, but we've covered some of this already here, but we'll go over this and we could probably move fairly quickly in these slides, but we're talking about diligence is legal, financial, tax, operational, and what we call soft diligence. So legal diligence, pending or potential lawsuits, significant payer vendor and or service provider contracts, office equipment and other significant leases, employment agreements, operating shareholder agreements, employee benefit agreements, whether it's pension plans, health benefits, pension retirement plan agreements, property liability and other insurance policies, and there could be copyrights, trademarks, and patent findings. Mike, do you want to touch on one or two of these?
Sure. So I think we've mentioned a few times, a lot of the due diligence in this area is to identify risk or liabilities, particularly ones that would survive a transaction and become a liability of the buyer. So pending lawsuits is a good one. Malpractice history, looking at vendor agreements to see what obligations exist and whether they've gotten the benefit of some contracts, but the payment obligations are on the back end, or vice versa. Employment agreements, I mentioned earlier, you really need to understand where all of your associates are in their career. If there are folks who expect to make partner immediately before a closing or immediately after, you're going to need to have a plan for that. And the buyer's going to want to be involved in how that looks. They don't want to assume a disgruntled staff, especially the clinical providers. The other thing about this phase of due diligence is you're identifying any types of notices, consents, or approvals that you need, whether that's from third parties like vendors, staff, employees, associates, government approvals, whether that's a certificate of need, whether that's a particular license to provide services. But that becomes a work stream that you need to deal with in order to close, and it's identified during legal due diligence.
So I'll touch upon financial due diligence, which is really my role in any transaction. So if available, we're looking at financial statements, whether internal, management prepared, and/or CPA prepared, whether compiled, reviewed, or audited. Again, it's likely with a small practice that they don't have any type of CPA prepared with financials, whether it's a review or an audit. They look at tax returns. The key document, and this really, the quality of earnings report is a key financial kind of living and breathing document during the transaction, which is used in mostly larger deals, but I've seen it on smaller deals where it's required by the buyer. And the quality of earnings is used by investors to evaluate the accuracy of a target company's historical earnings and the quality and sustainability of normalized historical earnings into the future. It's used by prospective buyers with the critical information needed to value a target, i.e. to validation of the purchase price. And what we see in most practices that never had a requirement to prepare GAAP or accrual basis financial statements. And with accrual basis financials, you're really talking about the most significant variable item there is accounts receivable, which is not reported on a tax return if it's cash basis. So very often what we'll do with the quality of earnings, we'll convert the books in a limited way from cash to accrual. This is especially important if you're a practice that's growing significantly and you haven't had, and the collections haven't caught up to the additional billing or charges for patient services. So, but we look at this very carefully, and typically you go back 2 to 3 years, and then as a transaction moves forward, the buyer will want that quality of earnings updated monthly to make sure there's no significant adjustments that'll affect the future earnings. So this is a key document that's used in the financial diligence. Most of the larger private equity-backed deals, the buyer's financial team will prepare it. My view, and I think a lot of people on that do transaction advisory provide, advice in transactions like this, will recommend that the seller does a sell-side quality of earnings, because you really kind of set the narrative. Because in the quality of earnings, you're taking historical earnings and making adjustments, normalizing for let's say perks of physician owners or staff, conversion of cash to accrual, and any other monthly adjustments that may be out of the accounting period. So our feeling is for the right size deal to do the quality of earnings on the sell side and let the buyer use that to evaluate the business. And let them refute if they disagree with any of the assumptions or add backs made in the sell side quality of earnings. Other analyses that will assist buyer in evaluating the quality of earnings: payer concentration, provider mix, whether it's physician versus mid-levels, net working capital analyses, debt schedules, key performance indicators for patient volume, CPT code mix, staffing / full-time equivalents, related party transactions. You see this very often where some of the underlying leases, the property is owned by the physician owners. They also will want to see P&Ls by site, service line, ancillary services. So you do your best to try to get all this done well before the sale takes place, or you're even entertaining offers. But a lot of times this just happens as the deal moves forward and you go through financial diligence. Heather, I'm going to hand this off to you, tax due diligence. And when you talk about ordinary income and capital gains, I'm sure everyone on the call knows that there's a 17% arbitrage, putting aside self-employment taxes. Capital gains are 20%, ordinary income at 37%. So we talk about how important it is for tax structuring. Heather will provide some insight on that.
So for due diligence, what we do is we typically take a look at the last 3 years of federal and state income taxes, their sales and use filings, their payroll taxes, property tax and unclaimed property. And the reason for this is that depending on how the deal is structured, the buyer is going to succeed to that, to do any like historical tax exposure. So if the seller hasn't been filing tax in a certain state or sales tax in a certain state, when buyer buys that entity, if the state comes in and audits it, then the buyer is on the hook to satisfy that liability. So they go and they do diligence to find out, like, has the entity been filing everywhere they need to, and are they compliant? We look at tax audits, and we also have a call with management as well as like their tax advisor to kind of get a feel and idea of their tax compliance procedures. Like, do they have risk management in place? And then let the buyer know, like, hey, these are the exposures we think you could be stepping into. And what that also does is, this last point here is it assists legal counsel in the preparation of the transaction documents. So does that in multiple ways. There are going to be tax representations that the seller is going to make in the agreement, and the buyer will then have an idea of, okay, these are the representations that seller can't make, or that they can make, but they have to disclose it in the agreement, and not just letting seller control that. Buyer has an idea of whether or not these statements are true. And then it also helps say, hey, to your attorney, we need a tax indemnity for this, or we need, an escrow for this. And so we will help add those buy-side protections into the agreement when we identify those risks. On the sell side, this is with what Mike was talking about earlier, was like uncovering the skeletons prior to the buy side finding it. And then maybe we can put things in place that you're fixing it, so that, when you're a week out from closing and they want to escrow a large amount because of some sales tax exposure. One, if you had a sell side due diligence done, you can go back to that team. And I've had this happen before, where buyer was asking for a large escrow for an exposure, and we had done a sell side due diligence. So we got on the phone with the buyer and we argued for it. And so we were able to not have that escrow in the purchase agreement. And so when you have somebody on your side to fight against those buy side exposures that are brought up, it's like has been helpful to the seller.
And then as far as tax structuring, when you touch on that, Heather?
Yeah, so tax structuring, this is largely what I was talking about in the beginning of tax structuring. Is, I think, one of the most important ways that taxes come into deals, is because the gain is generally going to be the same, but the way that gain is taxed and the character of that gain is different for the buyer and the seller. And so it is important to know as a seller what you prefer. So when that LOI comes across the table and there is tax structuring, there's typically a paragraph in there that says, buyers requesting an asset sale or an equity sale or a stock sale, what that means and whether or not you need to push back. And also to be wary of the word equity sale. A lot of times people see, oh, they're buying my equity. That's a stock sale, but that's not necessarily true in tax world, because equity can be treated as an asset sale in tax world. So you just have to have your tax advisor take a read of it to let you know, like, okay, it says it's an equity sale and it's going to be treated this way. Because they could also say we're going to buy a stock sale with a Section 338H10 election. You see the word stock sale and you're like, oh, great, I got a stock sale. But that election is an election for tax purposes to treat it as an asset sale. So it is important to like understand from the LOI, like what it actually means.
And I'll
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Heather.
and then just what we were touching on before is not to assume that your sale is going to automatically be capital gain, that there could be a portion with the way that it's structured that could be treated as ordinary, as well as, you know, state tax consequences to the gain.
Leah,
And the one thing I'll add on the second bullet under sell side structuring, model after tax proceeds to sellers for various proposed transaction structures. This can be done really early on, and it should be done because you don't want to get to a point where an LOI, and I've seen this also where the seller says, what am I going to end up with? What do my taxes look like? And based on, you know, whether it's an S Corp, a C Corp, a partnership, based on the deal structure, modeling can be done. And I work with Heather and her M&A team, and they do a great job in letting the seller know that if there's 2 or 3, you know, partners in a position that practice that are selling, each of them would at least like to know what their reported income looks like and what their after-tax proceeds look like, which is the bottom line, what's most important.
Yep, that's right. And then a lot of times you're not going to know which if you want a stock or an asset sale, say you're an S corporation, and you have the option of a stock or an asset sale, you may not know whether or not an asset sale is beneficial to you unless you do the tax model. So that's like how we can help with that. And then additionally, if let's say you are a Florida resident and a stock sale is going to be beneficial to you, the tax model can also determine what's called a make-whole payment. So sometimes buyers will say, okay, well, I really want an asset sale. I know that it's at a detriment to you. I will give you more proceeds so that net tax, the cash that you walk away in your pocket in an asset sale and a stock sale is the same. And so that's an iterative calculation because the more proceeds you get from buyer, the more tax you have, and it's circular. And so we figure out like what the make-whole payment would be for a seller who is going to be hurt by an asset sale, what additional proceeds buyer would need to give them in order to make them whole. So that's another way that a tax model can be utilized.
Leah, one thing just to add to that, and we could spend a whole day on this particular issue, but for folks who are listening in and considering transacting with an MSO, you need to be prepared for a little bit more complex structuring around spinning off non-clinical assets to an MSO buyer and whether or not the clinical assets need to remain in your PC or go into one of the buyer's PCs. And then there's the added complexity of often rollover as a form of consideration. And with Heather and Lee's help, hopefully you can get that rollover equity on a tax deferred basis.
So we're kind of winding down. There are a few slides to go. So the last area of diligence is operational and what we kind of call soft due diligence. So under operational due diligence, it's the buyer will review staffing. They'll want to see an organization chart, key employees, FTEs by department. Of your total staff, how many are physicians, nurse practitioners, other mid-level providers? How many are administrative? What employees are in each office? MAs, technicians. They want to kind of understand the FTEs, full-time employees by department. They want to understand the salary structure. What are the bonus arrangements? Are the staff getting? Do they participate in a 401k or profit sharing plan where the practice contributes? They want to look at systems and procedures, level of technology. Are they using cloud-based applications? Are they using AI? Under soft diligence to the right, same type thing. They want to look at the culture and the leadership. They're getting into bed with the seller, especially if the seller's physicians and staff will be staying on. They want to get a sense of what we call the change approach, evaluating the prospects for a successful post-transaction integration. And that's where a buyer just has to kind of get a warm, cozy feeling that there won't be any real pushback on maybe transitioning to a new EMR or a new billing platform. So we could all touch upon this, but again, ideally, what you're really looking for, and it depends on the size of the deal. In a larger deal where there are many opportunities out there that you may not be aware of, other buyers, you may want to bring in a transaction advisor. And we at Citron or Mike at Nixon Peabody, we have relationships with transaction advisors, especially in the healthcare space. So we're more than happy to make those introductions. So whether you call it a transaction advisor, investment banker, or business broker, different names, same roles, they get paid a success fee for hopefully finding the best deal for you, not only purchase price, but in terms of terms. They guide you through the transaction process, from preparing initial offering documents with the guidance of Mike and Heather and all your other advisors. An M&A attorney, that's a given. They'll advise and help coordinate the buyer's document requests, prepare or review transaction documents, whether it's LOIs, purchase agreements, and a financial advisor such as Citron Cooperman. We have roughly 20 people on staff in our transaction advisory services group. All they do is quality of earnings. So depending on the deal size, we do a lot of sell side and also buy side Q of E's. And we'll represent the seller during the financial due diligence, because very often the seller doesn't have a maybe a higher level CFO or even controller, so they may want us to assist in that. And tax structuring, that's where Heather's group gets involved.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, Lee, is when you're looking for your team, look for somebody that is an M&A attorney. There's a lot of deals that I've been involved in where they get a single shingle guy that's just kind of a general corporate lawyer, and structuring, particularly an MSO structure, is like unusual, and they are not familiar with it. And you do not want to be in a situation where the other side has a specialized M&A attorney and then you do not. Or another thing I've seen is like, oh, I got my tax guy on it and he doesn't do M&A transactions. And so when there's questions like, hey, like, what's the difference between a stock or an asset sale? What's my gross up? They don't know, because they just focus on tax compliance rather than transactions. And so that's something that I would recommend, is getting somebody who specializes in M&A for both tax, financial, and your legal advice.
Yeah, I always joke around, the physician owners tend to use their brother-in-law who's an attorney who helps them with their real estate leases. And once they go down that road, forget about it. Eventually they typically will say, listen, I'm out of my area of expertise. You better bring in somebody. So it's dollars well spent.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, you have any closing thoughts?
I think this has been great. I appreciate Lee and Heather inviting me to participate. I echo everything you said about financial and accounting and legal advisors. I'd also say, to Lee's last comment, a lot of our clients have an accountant that's helped them with their bookkeeping for years, and a lawyer that's done their day-to-day legal work, but neither have done transactions like this. And I know, having worked with Lee and Heather, and my experience, we're sort of happy to work with your regular advisors and sort of work hand in hand. There's no issue with the historical representation. We work together. They help with matters that are in their wheelhouse, and we help with the transaction, and same on the accounting side. So I guess the parting words is, preparation and getting ahead of things will bring value to a seller in a transaction.
So that kind of winds down the presentation. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Heather, for joining. Jimmy, any final thoughts, any questions that came in? We're pretty much out of time, but I'm trying to field any questions if you do have any.
One question came in about the recording. We will have a recording of this webinar, and it will be sent out to all registrants and attendees.
Okay, great. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.